right. Thank you very much, Holden. That was great. All right, I want to mention the topic that I'm going to be talking about. Ectopic life is the title of a book that I have out there. If you want to grab a copy of the book, I am not going to cover even close to everything that's in the book in this discussion. There's no way to do it. And the book, of course, doesn't cover, there's a lot more on this that could be said. But this young lady that you're looking at in the screen there, her name is Elena Hollis. She was born in December of 2022. Her mother's name is Marin Hollis. In August 24th of 2022, the state of Tennessee announced that their trigger law was going to go into effect. And their trigger law is a law that was written that said that when Roe v. Wade is overturned, we're going to outlaw abortion, for most cases. And so that law went into effect August 24th, 2022. Marin Hollis at that time was about 6 weeks pregnant, and she had just found out that, I think it's 10 weeks pregnant, and she had just found out that her pregnancy was an ectopic pregnancy. So Elena was not in her womb, she was outside of the womb. Instead of being where she's supposed to be, growing in another part in her mother's abdomen. And the lawyers at that time and the doctors all thought that Tennessee's trigger law would mean that there's no abortion allowed for anything, no matter what the purpose. And so they told her that. They told her, you can't get an abortion for this ectopic pregnancy, but you really, really need one because this is dangerous, it's life-threatening. There is a 7% chance that you're going to die if you carry this pregnancy to term. And I don't know if you caught that number, 7% of a chance that she was going to die. And they said, this is a life-threatening pregnancy, it's an emergency, you need to have an abortion right away. And so her doctor tried to get someone to perform the abortion. And he went from hospital to hospital, specialist to specialist. None of them were willing to perform the abortion because of the legal situation in Tennessee. And so, since no one wanted to perform the abortion, she ended up carrying the child to term. And on December 13th, Marin Hollis started bleeding. That's at 26 weeks long. She was stabilized at a local hospital and then driven to Vanderbilt. I don't have the clicker. Is it up here somewhere? She was driven to Vanderbilt, and they did a C-section delivery of Elena, who was born with a weight of 1 pound, 15 ounces. Elena spent 1 week in the NICU there at Vanderbilt and was released a week after her birth. Her mother, Marin, received a couple of blood transfusions and stayed in the hospital for 4 days and then was released. And now Elena is a healthy baby girl in spite of being the result of an ectopic pregnancy, in spite of not growing in her mother's womb, but growing somewhere else in her mother's abdomen. And the response that you got to this just floored me. This is just a few years ago, so I had already done all my research on ectopic pregnancy. I already knew that this was possible, that lots of babies had been born from ectopic pregnancies. So the result was not a surprise to me, but it was a surprise to a lot of people. And as expected, the pro-abortion crowd were just excoriating Tennessee. You're going to cause women to die. How dare you not allow her to get an abortion for an ectopic pregnancy? And I'm thinking the whole time, she didn't die. She's just fine. She's going on normal with her life. She came through with no problem. And now she has a new baby. And Marin was actually pro-life. She didn't want to have an abortion to begin with, but they told her she needed one to save her life. And so then when the baby actually was born and everything went great, she was happy. She was excited. But all the pro-choice people, the pro-abortion crowd, they jumped on the bandwagon and said, this is terrible. Tennessee needs to change their law and make it clear that they allow abortions for ectopic pregnancy. And Tennessee ended up making that clear. It was already the case in their law that they had an exception for ectopic pregnancy, but of course the lawyers don't really, the legislators and people don't really understand the law until someone comes along and explains it to them. So they had someone come and explain it to them, and then they said, oh yeah, we had this exception. I expected that from the pro-abortion crowd. What floored me was the pro-life crowd that came along and said, yes, you're right. Tennessee should have never allowed Marin to suffer and to give birth to this child. This child never should have been permitted to be born. They should have done an abortion when she first discovered that her pregnancy was ectopic. I mean, that just floored me. I'm thinking, you're pro-life. I mean, you're supposed to be in favor of life. Why are you not rejoicing that this precious baby has now been brought into the world? And instead, you're complaining that a baby was allowed to be carried to term and to survive. And so that was the response of the pro-life industry. And then there were a lot of people, I took advantage of this as soon as I heard about it, and I started posting on Twitter and on Facebook and everywhere that I could post, everywhere that there was an article written about this event, this birth, where they allowed comments, I would put a comment and introduce my research. And there were a lot of people that had never heard that a baby could be born from an ectopic pregnancy. And that's been, my experience generally. When I present my research, people are like, wow, I'd never even heard of that. But it happens a lot more often than people think. But the question I get is, how in the world is that possible? It's got to be just a miracle. It's just a random miracle that happened, but it's not actually a miracle. We have a promise from God that he always makes a way. I think it's nope, that's not that slide. I didn't put it there. All right, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13 tells us, God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way of escape, that ye may be able to bear it. And back in 2010, as when I first got involved in the personhood movement. We were starting a personhood chapter in Alabama. It was me, Roy Moore's chief of staff, Ben Dupree, and a couple other folks in the Montgomery area that joined together and formed Personhood Alabama. We invited some folks from the National Personhood USA, which is, they're no longer in existence, but we invited them to come in and introduce the concept to the people in Alabama, held a big conference. And at that event, they said that there's absolutely no reason for a woman to ever have an abortion except if she has an ectopic pregnancy. And they said that's the one case where an abortion is absolutely necessary because the baby can't survive and the mother's not going to survive either, and they're both going to die unless you take the life of the baby. And so when that was first introduced to me, that concept that, I had never even heard of an ectopic pregnancy before that. I'm sorry. Not being a woman myself, I didn't even consider the complications of pregnancy. But that idea that God would create this situation where you have no choice but to kill a child, I thought that doesn't fit with Scripture. And this verse came to mind, 1 Corinthians 10:13, that when God presents a temptation to do something wrong, so murdering a child is wrong, so he puts that temptation or allows us to go into that temptation, and that presentation there, he always makes a way to escape so that we don't have to do something that is wrong. There's never a situation where we have to do something evil in order to continue with life or serve God. There's always an opportunity to do the right thing. And so I thought with ectopic pregnancy, there's got to be a way where we don't have to kill the child. And so I started searching, looking for answers, started back in 2010. This is what I started finding when I first searched for answers. Places like WebMD, they said, can a baby survive an ectopic pregnancy? No. It's important to note that the fertilized egg, they don't say baby there, the fertilized egg in an ectopic pregnancy is not viable. That means it's impossible for the egg to survive and grow into a baby that can survive in or outside of your body. Okay, so that was what WebMD said. A lot of people go to WebMD for information. A lot of other people go to the Mayo Clinic for health information. The Mayo Clinic says an ectopic pregnancy can't proceed normally. The fertilized egg can't survive, and the growing tissue may cause life-threatening bleeding if left untreated. I go to another one, the Cleveland Clinic. They ask, can my pregnancy continue after an ectopic pregnancy? Unfortunately, an ectopic pregnancy is fatal for the fetus, and your pregnancy can't continue. Once an egg implants outside your uterus, you can't move it to your uterus. Healthline also says the same thing. Ectopic pregnancies aren't safe for the mother. Also, the embryo won't be able to develop to term. It's necessary to remove the embryo as soon as possible for the mother's immediate health and long-term fertility. And so this is what you find if you search just the public-facing websites that talk about ectopic pregnancy. So any place online that talks about ectopic pregnancy and it's just accessible to the general public, is if you just search in Google, what do I do with an ectopic pregnancy? They're all going to say something like what these websites say. The people that make these websites, though, that write these articles, they know differently. They know that what they just said on those articles is false. When you look at the actual research, the actual medical papers that are written, you find something completely different. This is from a paper written in 1982 by John F. Clark. He's a doctor in the Washington, or was a doctor in the Washington, D.C. area, an obstetrician. He specialized in unusual cases, the difficult cases in obstetrics and gynecology. And he said the fetal mortality rate in advanced abdominal pregnancy, that's another word for an ectopic pregnancy, in advanced abdominal pregnancy is high, with the salvage rate being between 20 and 40%. So salvage rate, what he means there is the babies that are born. So he's saying in 1982 that in his experience, between 20 and 40% of babies in an ectopic pregnancy were born alive and healthy. And then he went on to say most mothers are seen after fetal death has occurred. So usually when they discover the pregnancy back then, they didn't have all the early detection methods that we have now. He says the baby's already died. But if an earlier diagnosis were made, the results in fetal salvage would be greater. So he said there would be an even greater chance of the children surviving if we could find them before they had already died. That was in 1982, and I found this when I started studying the actual medical journals and the actual medical papers written on the subject of ectopic pregnancy. Wrong way. All right, another one, 1935. This is going back even further. Dr. Alfred M. Hellman, who we'll talk about him later, he ended up cataloging 316 live births from ectopic pregnancies. Back in, and his calculation went up to about the 1930s. So going all the way back into the 1800s and up to the 1930s, he found over 300 cases that had been reported in medical literature. And he said one finds perfectly normal infants in extra-uterine pregnancies far more often than some authors would have us believe. And so here's this doctor way back in 1935 saying, yeah, I've studied all these ectopic pregnancies and the babies are perfectly healthy. Yes, it's a high-risk pregnancy, but that doesn't mean it's fatal. It's nowhere near fatal, or nowhere near certainly fatal. The content on the public sites that we looked at earlier is, I've come to find out, it's vetted by their marketing teams and their lawyers. So they don't just put out there what's true. They put up what is going to get them in the least amount of trouble, they think, if someone follows that advice and then something happens and then they try to sue them. And so their statements about the ectopic pregnancy being certainly fatal, there's no chance of the mother surviving, no chance of the child surviving, that's not based on the actual research, it's not based on the actual science. That's based on a lawyer telling them, you better put this up there or someone's going to die and then they're going to sue you. And the way I found that out is that when I first published my information back in 2012, the Mayo Clinic would be a good example. they changed their website to match my information when I first published it. And because it was getting so much attention, and they said, oh, we better not look like we're idiots here because this guy has some good stuff. So they changed their website to match what I was saying. And then apparently a lawyer came along and told them they needed to change it back. But if you go through the Internet Archive and you look at the archived pages of their website, you can see where they changed to say, okay, there are some cases of live birth from ectopic pregnancy, but it's rare. And then a few years after that part disappears and they go right back to the old statement. And we're going to bring that up again in just a second. All right, so some of the findings that I found. Instead of it being certainly fatal for the mother if she goes through an ectopic pregnancy, what I found is there's a 99.84% likelihood of maternal survival if she is treated with autotransfusion or with a blood transfusion instead of abortion. Autotransfusion is a procedure that was developed in 1914 in Germany, which is why it's a long word, because the Germans like their long words. And so back in 1914, a doctor had a lady that was experiencing an ectopic pregnancy. A major rupture had happened, which, by the way, the rupture that is potentially fatal in an ectopic pregnancy is usually not the rupture of the tube. That's what all the popular literature says, is that, oh, if you go through a tubal rupture, the mother's going to bleed out and die. It's usually not the rupture of the tube. That happens very early in an ectopic pregnancy when the child grows beyond that narrow little tube. What happens is the child then reimplants onto an organ in the abdomen, and as the child grows, he can cause a tear in that organ that he implants on, and that bleeding can cause some major damage. So like, for example, one of the riskiest one is if the child implants on the liver. The liver has a huge blood supply going through the liver, and if the child causes a tear in the liver, that can cause some massive bleeding. And so this doctor in Germany had a situation like that, where there was some massive bleeding with a woman that was under his care, and he did not have a blood supply to replace the blood that she was losing. And so just on the fly, he came up with this idea of siphoning her blood out of her abdominal cavity where she was bleeding, siphoning that blood out, sending it through a cheesecloth filter, and pumping it right back into her body. And so it's auto-transfusion. So blood transfusion, that's auto means self. And so he's giving her own blood back into her body. This has been used hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times all around the world. It's not used much in America because we have a good blood supply here, but it's used a lot of times in third world countries for ectopic pregnancies and for other situations also. In 2002, there was a study done of 632 uses worldwide of autotransfusion for ruptured ectopic pregnancies. Out of those 632 cases, there was only one case of death. And they did not state what was the actual cause of death, but out of all 632 that they studied, there was only one case of death. That's a survival rate of 99.84% for the use of this treatment of autotransfusion. They also found that there's no limit to how long autotransfusion can be used to keep someone alive. So a mother who is bleeding internally, they can use autotransfusion to keep her alive indefinitely until they get the baby delivered, they take care of the bleeding problem, and she's able to leave. So there's a with that treatment, there's a 99.84% maternal survival from ruptured ectopic pregnancy. Now, not all of them rupture, but of the ones that rupture, it's almost a 100% survival rate if the doctor actually knows what he's doing. And that's part of the problem, is that none of this is taught in medical school, and the doctors are taught there's nothing you can do for an ectopic pregnancy except an abortion. And so when they come across one, that's the only thing they know to do, is an abortion. And when they come across one and that's already at full term and they're trying to deliver, they don't know how to handle the situation. In most of the cases that I have found and actually looked at in the literature of maternal death, most of those cases are from the doctor making a mistake in the delivery. Most of that having to do with the placenta, because the placenta is attached to an organ in the abdomen. and the doctors have no idea how to remove the placenta from that organ. And many times in attempting to either remove the placenta, they'll cause massive bleeding and the lady will die, or they'll choose to just leave it there and it will turn septic and the lady will die later from sepsis because they have no training whatsoever. Most of them in America, most doctors have never even heard of, or the ones I've talked to anyway, have never even heard of autotransfusion as a possible life-saving measure for ectopic pregnancy. All right, the next statistic here, 24% fetal survival with expectant management, and this is based off of numbers from the 80s. So today that number could be much greater, but I don't have statistics from today because they've pretty much stopped researching fetal survival from ectopic pregnancy since Dr. Clark's work in the 80s. But using his work in the 80s, he found that expectant management is watchful waiting. It's where the lady is kept either, if her pregnancy is very high risk of rupture, she's kept in the hospital until it's time to deliver the child, or she is kept at home close to the hospital where she can get to the hospital if she needs to, and just wait until the baby develops enough in order to be delivered by C-section. Following that method for ectopic pregnancy, there's a 24% chance that the child would be born healthy and survive the neonatal period and go on to live a normal life. This usually requires, or in some cases, this requires 24-hour monitoring just in case something happens and the doctors are right there and able to provide blood transfusions. The way I came to this number, based on Dr. Clark's numbers, 58% of children in a tubal pregnancy, when they rupture the tube, 58% of them survive the tubal rupture, and those reimplant somewhere in the abdomen and continue growing. Of those that reimplant in the abdomen, 42% of those will reimplant on a surface that has a good blood supply. Some of them will implant somewhere that they can't form a blood supply for the umbilical cord to bring blood to the baby, and so the baby doesn't have enough blood to survive and it dies as a result. But 42% of them are going to reimplant on a surface in the abdomen where they can get a good blood supply, and they'll progress all the way to birth. All right, there have been 2 successful transplants resulting in birth. I had no idea that this was even possible until I'm just studying through the literature, and I found a random reference to a 1917 attempt at a transplant. Dr. C.J. Wallace, in 1915 is when he did the transplant. He published it in 1917. And he said, "In this day of advanced surgery with the art of transplanting different parts and, in fact, organs of the body, I wonder at the escape of so important a procedure entailing so little danger as the transplanting of an ectopic pregnancy from the fallopian tube into the uterus." And that was something that he did, and he reported that case in 1917. He had a young lady that came to him. She was having surgery for something else. She didn't know that, she didn't even realize she was pregnant, but she had an ectopic pregnancy. And so he was performing a surgery on some other organ in her abdomen, had her opened up for the surgery, and he noticed there was a lump in her fallopian tube. And so he, on examination, he realized, hey, this is a child that has lodged in the fallopian tube. This is an ectopic pregnancy. And he was already performing a surgery, and he thought, he knew the patient, knew that she had been trying to conceive, and they had been trying to have a baby for a long time. And he said, this is a perfect opportunity. And he very carefully cut out the part of the tube that the baby was attached to, made a tiny little incision in the uterus, and inserted the section of the tube where the baby was attached into the uterus, and sewed her all back up, and the baby survived, the mother survived, and had a normal, healthy pregnancy with just a very simple transplantation. And in his article on this, he's just going on and on about how great it is that we finally have this technology that we can transplant babies from the fallopian tube into the womb. And he waited 2 years to publish because he wanted to make sure that the child was going to be healthy and normal. And the child was perfectly normal. He followed up and made sure. And he was all excited This is going to be great. This is going to change the history of medicine. We're going to see more and more of these transplantations in the future as we're able to detect ectopic pregnancies earlier and earlier. And no one did anything. His article that he published was just completely lost to history. No one referenced it, and no one cared, unfortunately. He said, "We should make a supreme attempt to save the life of the growing child by opening the tube carefully and transplanting it into the uterus where nature intended it should go. It can be very quickly done. It does not endanger the life of the mother and may be her only chance to bear a child. I have not the least doubt that many such transplanted ectopic pregnancies will be reported in the near future." Unfortunately, his doubts were not well-founded there. That there was actually, he should have doubted a whole lot more than he did because no one wanted to embrace it. No one wanted to take the risk. I've found many doctors are risk-averse. They don't want to take the risk of a lawsuit if they do something and something negative happens. So no one did anything. No one ever made any other attempts until 1980. A doctor named Landrum Shettles made an attempt at a similar transplant, transplanting a child from the fallopian tube into the uterus, and again, it was successful. It was a very simple procedure, and it succeeded, and the child was able to grow normally and be born normally. And when Dr. Shettles published, he said that he thought that he was the first person to ever do that. And so he was writing his article about the procedure, and in the process, he was talking to some other doctors and telling about that, and a Brazilian doctor that he commented on told him, "Oh yeah, I heard about another doctor that did that," and told Dr. Shettles about Dr. Wallace's. And so Dr. Shettles gave Dr. Wallace credit for coming up with a procedure, even though he did it completely independently. He didn't know about Dr. Wallace's procedure at first. And so Dr. Shettles published, and it was again excited and expected people to jump on this and save lives, and again, silence. No one commented on his article. No one replied to it in the literature. They just wanted it to be forgotten and to go away, and it largely did. But these transplantations are known to scholars that research ectopic pregnancy. They can come across this information even more easier than I could. I don't have access to a lot of these medical libraries that these doctors have access to. And a few years back well, I say a few years ago, it's in the 90s. My wife makes fun of me. I say things, a few years ago that are, 50 years ago, and because I do all my research in the 17th and 16th century. So, to me, 50 years, that's real recent. But anyway, so back in the 90s, there was a paper published that claimed to be a comprehensive analysis of all the possible treatments for ectopic pregnancy, and it never mentioned transplantation as a possible treatment. There is a doctor, Dr. Grodzinkas, that challenged them on that. After that article was published, he wrote a letter to the editor, had it published in the next edition of that journal. Excuse me. And he said, "I'm surprised that y'all never mentioned transplantation." And he mentioned Dr. Wallace and Dr. Shettles. And he also mentioned a couple attempts that he had made himself. In his attempts, he didn't want to do surgery to actually transplant the child from the tube into the uterus. He tried to dislodge the child and kind of force the child to flow into the uterus on its own. And those were all unsuccessful, resulted in the death of the child from his attempts to cause it to be dislodged from the tube. But he mentioned all that in his letter. He said, "Why didn't y'all mention transplantation?" This is what the editors of the magazine wrote back, or the authors of the article wrote back. They said, "The main goal in treating ectopic pregnancy is to avoid major surgery, thus minimizing the risk of patient morbidity. Surgical handling and embryo transfer from the tube into the uterus, as described by Shettles, clearly does not apply to this current basic therapeutic principle." So in other words, they said, we're looking for solutions that don't involve surgery, and since your life-saving solution involves surgery, we're not even going to mention it. And so they knew about it, and they chose to hide it because they thought it was better to not have surgery than to save the lives of babies. That's our fault as people, as abolitionists. Back then it would have been as pro-life individuals, for failing to educate the public on the value of the unborn child. So our failure in that regard caused these doctors to place more value on avoiding surgery than saving the life of the baby. So there are 2 successful transplants. So we've got a 99.84% maternal survival rate, 24% fetal survival rate, 2 successful transplants, and here's the big one, more than 500 cases of live births that I have found personally. I've found published literature in medical journals, verified reports of more than 500 live births of children that were in ectopic pregnancies. I started with a catalog of 316 births published by Hellman and Simon back in 1935. And then there's been several doctors since then that have done collections of catalogs of these. Most doctors that talk about this in the literature, most of them say that their case is the first of its kind. And I'm thinking, well, I just read 400 others, but okay, yours is the first of its kind. But they're all excited that it's the first time that a baby has ever been born from an ectopic pregnancy. They talk about it being miracles that this child was born from an ectopic pregnancy. That's, again, an example of failure to educate, because they think this is the first time it's ever happened. I mean, these are not idiots. These are medical doctors, lots of education behind them to get their degrees, but they've never even heard of a child being born from an ectopic pregnancy, and they report it as if it's just the first time it's ever happened. The numbers of this are actually higher in areas that do not have early detection and abortion services available to them. That just makes sense. If a mother doesn't know that she's pregnant with an ectopic pregnancy because the technology isn't there to tell her that, then she's going to just keep carrying to term unless something happens. And so in places like India and Africa and South America, this happens a lot more frequently than it does in America or in Europe. Because in America and Europe, they can see that the baby's ectopic real early, and then they just automatically kill the child. But even in spite of that, there are still cases in America and Europe where the baby goes undetected and goes all the way up to term as an ectopic pregnancy. And then there are some cases where they detect it, and the mother says, no, you're not killing my baby, and she carries all the way to term. All right, so the reception of this. I published an article in 2012. That article is the first section in the book, just detailing all the scientific evidence that children can be born from an ectopic pregnancy. And, I was expecting a joyous reception, that people are going to be happy that, yes, these kids can survive. We can save lives. I was especially expecting that among pro-life individuals, to be happy that we now know that these children can survive, that there's treatment options available that do not include killing the child. Unfortunately, that expectation was to be dashed. I did not receive that type of a reception. And I came to find out that I should have known this to begin with, but came to find out this is a very sensitive issue, even among pro-life individuals. What I was met with first was skepticism, primarily from medical professionals, doctors and nurses. They did not outright reject what I said, and most of the Christian doctors that I've talked to about this have been willing to actually consider the evidence. Are you all familiar with Dr. Patrick Johnson? A couple of you? Okay. Dr. Patrick Johnson is a good example of what has been the typical reception. I published the article. He runs a group of pro-life physicians online. It's got a website for them. And so I published the information, sent it to him, said, hey, your website says that we have to have abortion for ectopic pregnancy. I disagree. Here's the reason why. And at first, he wrote back to me and said, no, this is crazy. You don't know what you're talking about. I said, just read what I wrote. And then I met him at a conference, and he saw me walk in the door of the conference, and he waved me down and said, Bill, I read your article. I 100% agree all of your science is there, the evidence is irrefutable, and he completely changed his position as a result of me presenting the research. And I very much appreciate that. He's now written several articles of his own advocating the same thing that I say. And so all the Christian doctors that I've presented the material to, when they actually take the time to read it, that's been the reaction. They go through and they look at the science, which is what they're supposed to do, and they come away saying, yes, this is true. Doctors that are not Christians generally won't even look at the evidence. And I've talked to a lot of them, just trying to get the information to them. Gynecologists, radiologists that are doing the ultrasounds to discover the pregnancies, the ectopic pregnancies. I'll present the information to them, and they just refuse to read it and just say, this is impossible. I was taught in medical school that the child can't survive. I don't care what you say. So I got a lot of rejection from that, but I appreciate their skepticism. Doctors in third world countries have been more willing than doctors in America to consider the evidence, and that's because they're presented with actual cases. They know that this actually happens. And then there was some acceptance, like Dr. Johnson. Every medical professional who has actually read the work has accepted it. Abolitionists have generally accepted this. The Abolitionist Society, different societies were just getting started in 2012, which is when I published the article, and so most of them have embraced what I've said about it. It's also been accepted by some folks that have plagiarized it, and so that's fine with me. I ask them to give me credit, but some of them do, some of them don't, but that's okay, as long as the information is getting out there. The greatest evidence of this being accepted was places like the Mayo Clinic changing their website for a while. And I had a lot of pro-abortion folks change from saying that ectopic pregnancy can never be survived to saying there are some cases where ectopic pregnancy can be survived by the child and by the mother. And so I saw that as a huge victory that they changed and actually said that for a little while. Unfortunately, the pro-life leaders in the pro-life industry did not jump on the bandwagon along with the pro-abortion leaders. And so the pro-abortion leaders decided, oh, since y'all aren't going to accept this, we're not going to accept it either. But there was a good bit of acceptance. One interesting account of someone accepting it comes from here in Texas. Y'all know Abby Johnson, right? Former Planned Parenthood director, and then came out and became pro-life, and there's a lot of debate over the whole situation with her coming out. And of course, you have the movie and all that she produced, and she's making a lot of money that none of us are making. But when I first published this, Abby Johnson responded to me and said, yeah, this is known in the abortion industry. She said, we had seminars talking about this at Planned Parenthood, talking about children being born alive from ectopic pregnancies. And then she went ahead and spread my article to her followers on Facebook and on Twitter for a couple of years. And then she made a complete 180. And I wondered for a long time why she made that 180 and why she then turned around and said, no, this is never possible. You know, Bill doesn't know what he's talking about. Don't listen to him. And I didn't know for the longest time. And I went to hear her speak when she came to Birmingham a few years ago. And she wasn't speaking on this. She was just speaking on her life and her experience. And she mentioned being raised Protestant. And when she left Planned Parenthood, they were Protestants. And then she said they became Catholic. And she gave the date of when she became Catholic. And right after she became Catholic is when she did that 180 and no longer agreed with me on ectopic pregnancy and started saying that it has to be, you have to have an abortion with an ectopic pregnancy, which that is the official position of the Catholic Church. And so I figured that probably explains why she made that 180. But she did accept it initially. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of rejection. Most of that is just flat denial. They don't want to reason with me. They don't want to look at the evidence. They just say, can't happen. In Alabama right now, there is a law on the books that was passed in 2012 saying that treatment for an ectopic pregnancy is not considered an abortion, and so the doctor is free to do whatever he wants without regulation of any kind. I fought against that law as a friend of mine that introduced that law. And I went to him and said, why in the world? Here's my research. You know about this. You know that this is false. And he said, well, there's a doctor in my church who disagrees with you, and he puts more in my campaign than you do, so I'm going to do what he says. And so that's why that law got passed. I've contacted pro-life magazines. I've submitted my article to be published in the different magazines, and all of them rejected it. Places like the Personhood Alliance, so you would think they were initially formed in order to be 100% against exceptions, and yet they rejected in large part. I had to fight, and finally I gave up and just left on this issue. But I came to find out the number one reason that people rejected it is out of guilt. There are a lot of women in America who have either had an ectopic pregnancy or they know someone that has had an ectopic pregnancy, and the doctors told them your only hope is an abortion. In some cases, the doctor didn't even tell them. The doctor just went ahead and, they found the ectopic pregnancy while doing something else, and they just went ahead and aborted the pregnancy in the process, and then told the mother afterward. And so these ladies, when they hear that they could have given birth to a child, they didn't have to kill their child, it's an incredible amount of guilt that they feel. And it took me a while to realize that was what it was. But after talking to many of them, it dawned on me finally, this is guilt. And so there's an actual chapter in the book dealing with the guilt that people face regarding this issue. All right, and I'm going to have to hurry because we're running low on time here. Implications for the principle of double effect. The main argument for allowing abortion for ectopic pregnancy is the argument known as the double effect argument. It's a Catholic argument. It was developed by Thomas Aquinas many centuries ago. And so he was writing this, he developed this as a defense of self-defense, killing someone in self-defense. And when it was first applied to ectopic pregnancy back in the early 1900s, it was applied with the idea that abortion for an ectopic pregnancy was justified on the grounds of self-defense. They have since rejected that argument because they said, well, it's the mother's body that creates the condition, not the child. So if anything, the child should be able to defend himself against the mother, not the other way around. And it dawned on the Catholics that that was the case, and so they dropped the self-defense part, but they kept the double effect part. And it says it's morally permissible to cause harm as an unintended and merely foreseen side effect of double effect or double effect of bringing about a good result. They make 4 claims that they use to justify abortion using this argument. Claim number 1 is they say, considered by itself and independently of its effects, the action of removing the damaged fallopian tube with the child inside is not evil. My response is that's irrelevant. Considered by itself and independently of its effects, the action of pushing a car off a cliff is not evil. But if there's a baby in the car, then it's evil. So you can't just ignore all the other situations, just say, oh, removing a tube, there's nothing evil about removing a woman's fallopian tube. Well, it is if there's a child in there, just like pushing a car off a cliff. Their next claim, the evil of the child's death is not a means of the good or to the good, but rather a side effect of the goal of preventing maternal bleeding. So they say, our goal is not to kill the baby, our goal is to prevent the mother from bleeding out. And we just have to kill the baby in the process, is what they claim. But that's an unnecessary claim. Maternal bleeding can be controlled by means of autotransfusion to prevent maternal death without killing the child. Claim number 3, the death of the child is not the intent of the procedure and would be avoided if at all possible. And so I respond that it is possible to avoid the death of the child as proven by hundreds of live births. If you have children born alive, then it's possible for them to survive this without dying. And their 4th claim, if no action is taken, both the mother and the child will certainly die. Therefore, an action that saves one of them is permissible. And for this, I say that's just misguided. It is not certain that either of them would die, and the risk to the mother can be eliminated by transplantation. If you remember when I talked about Marin Hollis at the beginning, the doctors told her you have to have an abortion because there's a 7% chance that you'll die. And I see that in the literature all the time. They say there's this huge chance that the mother might die. It's like 8% that she might die. And so therefore she has to have an abortion. And there's not that huge of a chance. Now, even in the cases where it's very dire, it's not 100% and nowhere close to 100% that the mother would die if she carries to term. All right, here's the fun part of the whole presentation here. I want you to meet Eva Kalt. Eva is the little girl there. She was born in the UK. Her mother, Paula, discovered that she had an ectopic pregnancy at 20 weeks. She refused an abortion, said, I'm not going to kill my child. She was kept in the hospital with a blood supply on hand until 30 weeks. So for 10 weeks, she was in the hospital under care. And then they had a C-section delivery at 30 weeks, and little Eva was born. Billy Jones, he was born April 19th, 2008. His mother, Jane, discovered that Billy was in an ectopic position at 27 weeks. She was allowed to go home. It was not high risk, even though she was ectopic, so she was allowed to go home. 2 weeks later, or the plan was 2 weeks later for her to be brought in at 29 weeks to give him a little extra time to develop. But 1 week later, she had some intense pain. They brought her in and delivered to Billy by C-section. He was 2 pounds and 2 ounces. That's a little bitty fella. Mason Mancuso, got out of order here. Mason, his ectopic pregnancy was discovered at 30 weeks when his mom started bleeding. She had no idea that she had an ectopic pregnancy, and at 30 weeks she started having some unusual bleeding, went to the hospital, and they delivered little Mason 3 pounds, 6 ounces when he was born, delivered him by C-section. Millie Ann Pittman, in 2005, this is over in the UK, her mom had no idea that she had an ectopic pregnancy all the way up to term, and then they were doing a C-section delivery because the baby wouldn't come, and so they did the C-section delivery. Oh, now we know why the baby didn't come. The baby's not even in the womb. And so little Millie Ann was born at 8 pounds and 7 ounces. And then there's Paris Ortiz in New York. So this is in 2012. Again, similar to with Mrs. Pittman. In this case, Paris's mother, Sylvia, had no idea that her baby was an ectopic pregnancy. They were doing a C-section delivery, and then little Paris was born. I don't have her weight, unfortunately. Both of them survived just fine, but her mother required 40 units of blood and 2 operations. I don't have the actual medical report on her, just the public information, but from what I can gather, just from what the doctor said publicly, I think it was the doctor didn't know what to do with the placenta and caused some bleeding with trying to remove the placenta. All right, Valdir Gabriel, born in 2008. This is in Brazil, and his ectopic pregnancy was discovered at 5 months. And they told the mother that she had to have an abortion. She absolutely refused, said, I am going to carry this baby to term no matter what. And so at 8 months, little Valdir was born by C-section with no complications. Mother and baby were just fine. Durga Thangaraja. In the UK, the ectopic pregnancy was discovered during delivery, so all the way up full term, and Durga was in her mother's ovary all the way up to full term. She is one of only 2 cases that I have been able to find of an ovarian ectopic pregnancy going full term. Usually the baby doesn't survive because of that very small constricted space. But her pregnancy went all the way to full term in spite of being ovarian, and little, there we are. How did I get out of order? There's Durga. All right. And so Durga was born at 38 weeks at 6 pounds and 3 ounces. All right, now we'll go back to Azalon Cruz Perfecto in Arizona. They discovered that his mother had an ectopic pregnancy when he was at 18 weeks. His mother refused an abortion and then continued up until 32 weeks. And they delivered little Azalon at 2 pounds and 14 ounces, no complications from the delivery. Caden Smith, born in April of 2013, they discovered that he was an ectopic child, At 24 weeks, his mother refused an abortion. She carried him another 6 weeks, and they had a C-section delivery at 30 weeks, and he was born 3 pounds 1 ounce, no complications for either the mother or the baby. Miracle Asiro. This one, I like talking about. This one is in Uganda. This is very recently, July 28th of 2023. They discovered that she had an ectopic pregnancy at delivery at 38 weeks. She had some pain, and so they were going to go ahead and deliver the baby by C-section, and then discovered that she was an ectopic pregnancy. Gave birth to a healthy baby girl with no complications, and they took video of it and they posted it to Twitter. They didn't tell the news people right away. They didn't publish it in the scientific literature. They had cell phones, and they took a video of the C-section delivery and posted it to Twitter, and it went viral on Twitter. I was actually able to talk to one of the doctors that assisted in that delivery, and he was talking about how there were only 3 that he knew about in all of Uganda, and how this is extremely rare. And then I started talking to him about all these others that I discovered, and he was very happy to hear about my research. But this is just a tiny sample of all the ones that I've found. These are the ones that I found that actually have pictures of them. Most of them you don't have pictures because it's scientific literature and they don't include the pictures. They think you can just see the words. So most of them don't have pictures, but I found well over 500. I've been contacted by probably a dozen people that have told me that they themselves were born from an ectopic pregnancy, that they were talking to their mom about their birth, and she mentioned that there was an ectopic pregnancy. And then I've had probably 4 or 5 ladies contact me and say, hey, I heard about your article. I just wanted to let you know that I had an ectopic pregnancy, and my son is so many years old and doing great. My daughter's doing great. So there are lots of babies that have been born from these pregnancies. They are not a death sentence. And if we educate doctors so that not as many of them, or that more of them know what they're doing, we won't have as many of them causing the deaths of the mother just because they don't know what to do in this type of situation that they've never even heard of before. All right, so Daryl, I'll turn it back over to you.